join me in welcoming Mr. Glenn Baggett, Air Force veteran and post commander of the American Legion Post 73 in Houston County, who will present a brief overview of World War I. Glenn had a great uncle who served in World War I. Mr. Baggett.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. When I was asked to do an overview of World War I got to thinking there are so many aspects of the conflict, where to begin. So I thought I might do a brief discussion of the technology that was World War I and what these soldiers had to face. When we think of technology today, we think of self-driving cars or the computer that many of us have in our back pocket that just happens to make a phone call. 100 years ago, though, the technology concept was totally different. It was more about techniques and how to accomplish objectives. And I thought we could take a look at that for just a minute today. Initially, the European generals thought that the war, would be a battle of movement. Turns out it was a battle in the trenches. They had to figure out how to go from one side to the other and cross that no man's land without losing many lives. So the first technology advancement was the Army tank. Came out in 1915, British Mark I. Pretty soon France developed their own version with the turret on top, which has given us the symbol we know today as the classic tank. Another significant advancement, unfortunately, were gas masks. This was due to the introduction of the poisonous gas in the battlefields. Gas masks were developed not only for humans, but they had to do it for the pack animals and the horses as well that were exposed to it. Germans first deployed chlorine gas on the battlefield in April of 1915 in France, attempting to exploit a loophole in international law that said gas projectiles were to be banned. They figured there was no prohibition against simply releasing the deadly gas and letting the wind carry it to the other side. Of course, there had to be advances in ammunition. Through the history of combat, very few successful battles were ever fought at night. The British developed the first tracer rounds. First efforts are not so successful, but in 1916, they deployed a version that trailed a green and white light and allowed them to see where they were going. These rounds not only eliminated that, but it turns out they ignited the hydrogen that the Germans were using in the Zeppelins, brought down many of them that way. Hand grenades and mortars also saw significant improvements, which also meant significant damage to the soldiers. We're going to skip this. Not all advances came on the battlefield. A new profession that's critical to today's world operation developed out of World War I. In the first days of flight, when a plane left the ground, the pilot was pretty much on their own. No way to provide input or receive any information. The U.S. Army began experimenting with installing two-way radios in aircraft prior to World War I involvement. And in 1916, technicians could send messages up to a distance of 140 miles. They could send messages to other planes, and thus the air traffic controller was born. The medical profession saw advances due to one of the most notable, also saw advances. One of the most notable was provided by Marie Curie. She set out to reduce the size of X-ray machines so they could be installed in small trucks and cars. She had 18 of these radiological cars, or little Curies as they were called, that toured the field toured battlefields. African-American inventor Frederick Jones developed an even smaller portable X-ray machine. On a side note, Mr. Jones also invented refrigerator units, air conditionings, and a self-starting gasoline lawnmower. With the increase in the power of the bombs came the injuries to the soldiers. And one of the most important increases in battlefield medicine was the Thomas splint. It's still being used on the battlefield today. In 1914, 80% of the soldiers with broken legs died because of it. By the time the splint was implemented in 1916, 80% of those soldiers survived. New techniques in facial surgeries and burns were also developed. Huge advantage in prosthetic limbs and technology to meet the hundreds of thousands of amputees. This also ushered in the beginning of the ambulance corps. Before ambulances, soldiers were simply retrieved from the battlefield, loaded onto trains, and sent to the nearest town before they even started receiving medical care. Ambulances were able to start control the bleeding, clean the wounds, and begin those life-saving techniques hours or days ahead of time. One of the notables that came from this, the Volunteer Ambulance Corps, many people volunteered to serve as drivers. Authors E.E. Cummings and Ernest Hemingway were two. Businessmen Tony Hull, founder of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and Ray Kroc of the McDonald's Corporation also volunteered, even though the war ended before he got to serve. And now on a less technology-related note, the license plate that was on the car when the Archduke was shot read A111-118. Numerologists translate that to Armistice 11-11-18. Thank you for your time.